going to give us a presentation on the use of risk in environmental management and development.
Okay. Well, I guess my talk links most closely to Alistair's first talk because it's interdisciplinary work. It's research and practice, there's a fusion. And in fact, Nick Grayson, who I put as co-author, because I base a lot of my research on work that he's led for Birmingham City Council, was a partner of that research consortium that Alistair introduced. There's also a little bit of sort of reinvention, a bit. So, I mean, I chose this topic because you're all familiar with Birmingham. So there's something maybe of Birmingham that you don't know about that is coming up. So I look at risk. I've come across risk assessment in terms of genetically modified organisms. And I wasn't well impressed what risk assessment does, because I think it does a little bit, it doesn't do a lot. It looks at things in isolation. It's very much sort of a bit of a silo thing. But we respect it a lot. We rely on it. We use it. Okay? So it's respected. It's seen as objective. And whatever I've seen, also CFCs, they've all been risk assessed. But what happened? A lot of damage happened, and we didn't realize it for a long time. So I was a real skeptic about risk. So working with Nick and looking at the stuff that's been happening, it opened my eyes that risk is not all bad and shoddy and just a silo. It can actually be used very effectively. And that's that journey I'll take you through in about 8.5 minutes. So you recognize some of that skyline of Birmingham, like the rotunda there. So I'll just give you a little bit of context about the concept and uses of risk, and that's really the exciting bit, I think. It's the way it's been used. And then also a bit of a reflection about risk. So why am I so pessimistic about it, but why I'm also hopeful about it. Alistair also introduced sort of the grander picture of the problems we face right now. And there's a lot of pressures and drivers for change, really, and that relates to sustainability. We're driving for it, but we're not making much headway. We're really grappling with climate change, accelerated environmental change, and we think a lot more about health and well-being with all the problems we're facing, about be it asthma, obesity, and all the rest. Obesity is now actually a factor it's a sustainable indicator now nationally. So it's interesting, all these changes, and so we have to come out of our silo thinking. And Birmingham City Council actually sort of used the national indicator that was under the Labour government, so it's now old stuff, but it was very relevant at the time. These sort of hooks to hook on work to develop actually the green space for Birmingham and put really green space on the map. Because quite often these projects don't get funded, especially if you have an economic downturn time. These are soft, fluffy projects we can do without. Okay? So that was quite often the tendency. So even if you put a very good bid in, it doesn't go anywhere. So they had to find hooks. And one was the National Indicator 188, which is climate change adaptation. Another one is local area agreements. But also now, with more recently, through the coalition government, the health service is coming back into actually the local authority sort of administrative framework. So suddenly now you can actually coordinate the planning much better again. So I basically characterized the way that risk was used as risk being used as an evidence base, as a political hook, as a guide for investment and management, and as a communication tool. And I'll just take you through that in a wee bit more detail. So this was a collaboration between Birmingham City Council and the University of Birmingham. And they basically funded a PhD and they developed what they call the Buccaneer, which is Birmingham Urban Climate Change Adaptation, Neighbourhood Estimates of Environmental Risk. It's a mouthful, so stick with Buccaneer. But the interesting thing about that was that it actually tried to translate the national data for forecast or expected climate change to the local scale. Because a lot of the data really existed at the regional and national scale, but not at the local scale. So you need to put a lot of modelling into it and a lot of sort of data gathering to actually try and work out what would happen locally so that it actually can inform planning and policy at that scale. So there's lots of assumptions there, and I'm not also a great believer in modelling because whatever you put in comes out. So if you put rubbish in, rubbish comes out. But that work is pretty robust. And what is nice about it, it didn't just look at things in isolation, it really pulled a lot of things together. And this is just a small flavour, really. And one big thing about risk communication was to focus on climate change and the urban heat island effect. Urban heat island is not really a difficult concept. It basically means that if there's an increase in a very hot summer, increase in temperature, concrete city space, exhaust from transport basically make the situation a lot worse. Now you can see that it's sort of an aggregate diagram, and you see basically the city centre and sort of the key road transport routes really suffer heavily. Next to it is a map of ill health. So they didn't just look at environmental factors, but they made that connection with health and green space, which I'll show you. So the darker colors, so red is really basically bad, blue is quite good. In this case, darker green, the situation is worse. There's basically more ill health than in the light green. Okay, they got an award for this work. So look at this though, the heat wave again. There's sort of an aggregate picture of the urban heat island effect, and compare that with that green space. Okay? So as expected, basically, and it was just good to have that in a way in green and red, not black and white, but in a way you can translate that now nicely, that where there was green space, the heat island effect is obviously much reduced, and they call it actually the H-Baston sort of cliff, because there's a sudden increase in green space, and there's a sudden drop in temperature when the temperature is high. Now you might think, well, so what? Unfortunately, urban heat island, you get a lot of accelerated death if you have a heat wave hitting. And there's lots of data now where you can actually prove that in the medical data. So what is interesting about the Buccaneer tool, it had 31 GIS layers, so that's Geographic Information System that they used. A lot of modeling went into it, and they put a lot of sort of key factors in. It's not the world as a whole, but it's a pretty good overall picture. And then basically they developed these fine-grained urban heat island model. And then the key point is really to show that link with natural capital, with green space, okay, to make that argument. And then to also look into in more detail at the green infrastructure strategy. Because basically suddenly you have a much more powerful communication tool really here to ask for green space is valid. It's not just big firms, not just more housing that brings you money. Health improvement saves you money, and also just that better living space. And in terms of climate change, it can give you a lot of positive impacts. So here again is just to pick out that very strong connection between green space and urban heat island. So risk looks at different things. It looks actually at the hazards. So for example, in this case, at high temperatures, at the exposure, not everybody is susceptible to it. But for example, elderly people with ill health are particularly susceptible to it. And it's basically also certain areas in which you find it's usually, well, in that previous diagram, it was really the center that was most affected by it, and the main transport routes. So the political hook, I think that is really quite important, because you only get your money if your councillors and all the governors buy into this. So here we go. It basically stayed on the agenda. There was enough evidence emerging constantly that green space actually stayed on the agenda. There is now a Green Infrastructure and Adaptation Delivery Group, and it's now also being formed as a Green Commission. So green suddenly is actually on the political agenda. Okay? There's a lot of plans have been coming out, are about to come out. And what is nice about them, they're actually all interlinked now. There is not just things produced in isolation, there's actually cross connections established. And a key one is really the Green Living Spaces Plan that uses a lot of that research. It also makes the links with the policy discourses, be it the Lawton Report, Marmot Review, or Natural Capital and Ecosystem Assessment. So now it's basically used as an investment for development. Where should we actually make that change? What should we prioritize? How should we develop? And this is just to show you here that risk mapping is just one part of it. It then goes into contingency planning and into future proofing. I would challenge still that it was very much an expert-led approach. The people sort of buy-in comes later. But the idea is now that you produce those maps, you show them, you have them in the Green Space Plan, in the Green Living Spaces Plan, so that people, communities now can help actually to translate how do we actually want to translate it, what sort of should happen to make it work best. But it's just to say these things are now happening across, it's not just in isolation, and if you compare that with the award-winning Big City Plan, it's actually a very different picture now, because the Big City Plan was very much focused on economic development and other things were much more at the fringes. So things are developing and changing, but you don't see that much yet. But what is on the scene is basically, yes, linking all these things up. And I think that's interesting, because when you go out, you still struggle, you know, it's a lot of air pollution, not that much green space, even though we see some changes in the city centre, but there's a lot more change to happen. So this is now, it's a communication tool for each constituency. It's going out, there's a lot more work happening, the hotspots have been identified, and basically money will be channeled there. What is also interesting, it works explicitly with ecosystem services, and now increasingly also with a much more overarching holistic approach as it captured in the ecosystem approach. So the language is changing and also the conceptualization and the thinking associated with it is changing. So I just skip that for the moment. It's just to say that they work very well together. I just want to that. You've seen sort of the positive things of it, and I think that is really good. But I'm still slightly critical because I think what I quite liked about sort of the creative talks and the language one, it's actually then what happens. You can make all these plans, but it actually depends how it's then implemented, funded, and happening. So I think also there's a really important element of our creativity, our values to bring in, not just sort of maps and constructed data. So there's a lot more work out there. I will continue to work with them and shadow their work, and also challenge them to really take a very holistic approach, but also do much more bottom up. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.